Roy, whose educational background and achievements is there and very well documented in your program, it is really wonderful to have a man of your caliber and prestige to address us. I think most envious of your actions, Roy, sorry, not of your actions, but the actions of the Holy Spirit, will be that time when you were granted the great grace of meeting God and letting Him know that He loves you, and that you went through the process of saying, I hope you are not a Christ. I hope you are not Christ, and I have to become a Christian. For me, that was the most telling of the comments in your bio. But I'm sure, like me, you are looking forward to listening to Roy, and I have no hesitation in asking him to come up to the lectern and address us, from Harvard business professor to Roy Schoeman, Catholic evangelist, my witness testimony. Roy.
Hi, I'm very, very, very happy to be here. I hope you can all understand me despite my horrible accent. But I do want to correct a little bit of that introduction, but because of this morning's talk, which I found very, very beautiful and very moving, I have switched my tomorrow afternoon talk with my this afternoon talk. So today is not going to actually be my witness testimony, it's going to be the role of the Holocaust in salvation history. Because I couldn't hear the beautiful questions that came up after this morning's talk without kind of jumping out of my skin saying, ooh, I wrote a book about those things. So while we're still in the glow of the testimonies, I wanted to address basically the role of Judaism in salvation history from Abraham until the Second Coming, with a focus on the Holocaust and where that fits into God's divine providence, because everything fits into God's divine providence. So I hope you forgive me for that little switch around. But I will give, not really my witness testimony, but just say who I am. As the introduction mentioned, I had been a Harvard Business School professor and so forth. My parents are also German Jewish Holocaust refugees. They're a little bit older than the couple who spoke this morning. My father actually escaped from Germany in the early 30s when it was still possible, as long as you didn't take anything with you. My mother was less fortunate. Her family fled to France, which didn't work out too well. And while she was in occupied France, she was actually arrested by the Gestapo and put on a train to a concentration camp. But she escaped from the train and eventually made it to the United States, where my parents met and married. So I grew up very, very Jewish, and not only very Jewish, but with a huge chip on my shoulder against Christianity in general, and especially against the Catholic Church, which I don't know how many of you. Anyway, that came from my parents. That came from their sense of the Holocaust having been coming from the Christian world, let's say. So I just want to give that as a little background to where I'm coming from. Then I received the extraordinary grace, as was mentioned in the introduction, when I had lost my Jewish faith and was essentially atheist at about the age of 30. I was a Harvard Business School professor. I received two extraordinary graces. The first was a direct encounter with God, in which I saw my life as I will see it after I die, and I understood everything the way I will understand it after I die. And as a result of that experience, I knew basically most of the truths of the Catholic faith. I mean, I knew about divine providence, I knew about the love of God, I knew about heaven, and that we live forever, and that every action has a moral content that affects our eternity, and so forth. But what I didn't know was who this God was and what religion to follow. And again, as was mentioned in the introduction, at the time I was unwilling to accept that it was Christianity. But then about a year later, I had an experience of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She appeared to me and offered to answer any questions I had for her. I'm giving you a little teaser so you'll come back tomorrow afternoon for my witness testimony. And so I asked her 4, 5, 6 questions, and she answered them graciously. And after that experience, of course, I knew that my encounter with God had been an encounter with Christ, and I wanted to become Christian. So, but when I became Christian, or when I entered the Catholic Church, I was always puzzled when cradle Catholics would come up to me and kind of say, you know, welcome to our church, because I couldn't help thinking they had it backwards. It should be me going up to them saying, welcome to my church, because if the Catholic faith is true, it's nothing but the continuation of Judaism after the coming of the Jewish Messiah. It's not two separate religions, it's one religion. It's one plan that God had since the Garden of Eden, and that plan was divided into two phases. A first preparatory phase to essentially enable the incarnation of the second person of the Most Holy Trinity as a man at a future point in time. The Jews were chosen to enable that to happen. They were given a tremendous amount of divine revelation, which is the Old Testament, so that they would know about the one true God, they would know to worship him, they would know about the importance of moral purity and so forth, they would know about the future coming of a Redeemer, and they would be prepared to understand what happened when it happened. And that's what Judaism was, essentially. It was God had just picked one people out of all of the peoples on the earth, one could say at random, or one could talk about why he chose the Jewish people, to enable the incarnation of God as man, with the intention always being that once the second person of the Most Holy Trinity incarnated as a man, through his life, his suffering, his death, that special privileged relationship that God had given to the Jewish people for this role would be extended to all of mankind through faith in Jesus and the sacraments of the Catholic Church. Right? Catholic means universal. It was a universalization of God's intimacy with man to all of humanity through what happened as a result of the biggest event in creation history, which is the incarnation of God as man. So I don't think the story makes any sense at all if you see them as two separate religions. It only makes sense if you see it as essentially as one story with this absolutely central pivot point, which of course was the incarnation, suffering, and death of Jesus. Now, so the role of Judaism in salvation history, from essentially the fall of man until the incarnation, if you stop to think about it, is pretty straightforward. And I don't have time to really elaborate a tremendous amount on that right now. And I'm always a little sensitive about this because being Jewish, I don't want to be accused of trying to sell something. But I did write a book about this, which I am selling. So if you want the whole story, I have a table in the back during the conference with 2 books that I wrote and a bunch of other materials. And by the way, if you want them for free, the audio and video material is up on the internet, but on YouTube and on a website I have called salvationisfromthejews.com. So at least I'm partially converted. But anyway, there's a tremendous remaining fascinating mystery, which is what about the role of Judaism in salvation history in between the first and second coming? And that's what I really want to dwell on now. And the central event in the history of Judaism between the first and second coming is in fact the Holocaust. So the question is, what does the last 2,000 years of history, and in particular, what does the Holocaust tell us about God's plan for salvation and the role of the Jews in between the first and second coming? So let me start this part of the talk, I guess, with a quote from Pope Emeritus Benedict, which kind of just encapsulates the fact that there is a mystery here, and a very worthwhile mystery to delve into, which is the story of Judaism between the first and second coming. So let me just read the quote from Pope Benedict from his book, God and the World. Although the Jews have lived 2,000 years in exile, their religion has not evaporated. This is a phenomenon still without parallel in the history of mankind. It is quite obvious that the development of the world as a whole has a mysterious connection with the development of the Jewish people. The way the Jews are still Jews and are still a people, even during the 2,000 years when they had no country, is an absolute riddle. This phenomenon in itself shows us that there is something more than mere historical chance at work. It shows us something of the mystery of God. So that's what I want to talk about, is the mystery of God that's revealed in essentially the story of the Jews, especially between the first and second coming. So when you look at the story of the Jewish people between the first and second coming, one is struck by two things. One is that they exist at all, as Pope Benedict pointed out. There is no other example in the history of mankind of an ethnic group, and a relatively insignificant ethnic group at that maintained their identity for 2,000 years without a homeland, without a geographic center. And there's another aspect to the mystery, which is, frankly, anti-Semitism itself. Now, most ethnic groups have been hated somewhere in the world by some other people at some point in time. But there are not a lot of examples of a group that has been hated everywhere in the world by every other people at every point in time, like the Jews. And I will argue that anti-Semitism itself is a reflection of the fact of two things. One is, of course, the Jewish people are the people of Jesus. It bears, I suppose, reminding people that, of course, Jesus was Jewish, Mary was Jewish. The devil was defeated, of course, by Christ, by Jesus, and his blood relatives are the Jews. And, of course, the devil can't get at Jesus directly, so he wants to get at, of course, all of mankind, because he hates all of us. But if he has a particular grudge against a particular people, one could understand why that would be a particular grudge against the Jews, since they were the cause of his defeat, at least indirectly, through Christ. So with that as a background, I'll give another little thing as a background, which is Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 674, says, quote, "The glorious Messiah's coming is suspended at every moment until his recognition by all Israel." And this is a repetition of a doctrine, a Catholic doctrine that's been held since the very first Church Fathers, and it comes straight from the Gospels, and I'll talk about later where it comes from, that the second coming can't happen until there is a widespread, if you excuse the pun, wholesale conversion of the Jews. And so obviously, if there has to be a widespread conversion of the Jews to enable the second coming, one way for the devil to delay, or ideally even abort, the second coming would be if there's no conversion of the Jews, or if there are no Jews. So with that as a backdrop, let me move into the Holocaust itself. Now, we all know that the Holocaust came from Hitler's rise to power and the Nazis taking over Germany and then taking over much of Europe. What has been forgotten today is that there were three streams that flowed into the Nazi determination to eradicate the Jews. And let me say this, I really, really love this morning's talk, and I really, really love the presenters. And I consider myself still Jewish, although I'm a baptized Catholic. I consider myself a Jew in the Catholic Church. And my heart goes out because the questions that were raised after the talk by some people here, and the questions which lie behind everybody who survived the Holocaust, are questions which do not have an answer in Judaism. They only have an answer in the light of Christianity, and in particular in the light of the Catholic Church. And in particular, there is no theology of suffering in Judaism. There is no understanding of the redemptive value of suffering, whereas we as Catholics know that the one time in history when God became man to save all of humanity, his central act of redemption was that of suffering. That there is nothing more central to salvation history and to redemption than suffering itself. And without understanding that mystery, one can't really understand why God let what he let happen to the Jewish people. But I would actually argue that the fact that the Jewish people have been chosen for so much suffering over history, and in particular for the suffering of the Holocaust, is in itself an indication that they are the chosen people. Because that's what it means to be chosen, is to be chosen to be a channel of grace for mankind, and grace flows through suffering. And if I have time at the end of the talk, I'll read some quotes both from Jewish theologians and from St. Edith Stein that actually just really illustrate this very dramatically. So anyway, what are these three streams that led into the Holocaust, which provide evidence that the determination to exterminate the Jews didn't primarily come from, some kind of political calculus of Hitler about how to get the Jewish people behind him. On the contrary, it was a direct expression of the diabolical will. It was the streams that flowed into the Holocaust came straight from hell, and they were part of the devil's agenda, and they simply flowed through people who were available to the devil. And one reason for talking about this is because we're living in very serious times now, and I'm not going to dot the I's and cross the T's, but as I talk through this, I think that many of us will see reflections of the same kind of program that led into the Holocaust re-emerging today. So what were these three streams that flowed into the Holocaust? First of all, as the chief exorcist of Rome, Father Gabriele Amorth, has said, quote, Hitler was certainly consecrated to Satan. Hitler was a Satanist. Hitler was an occultist. His first springboard to public prominence was an occult society in Munich called the Thule Society. The head of the Thule Society was an occultist named Dietrich Eckart, who bragged, quote, I have initiated Hitler into the secret doctrine, opened his centers of vision, and given him the means to communicate with the powers. What's initiation? From the point of view of the occultist, initiation is being given gifts to see into the spiritual world, to speak to the spiritual world, and so forth. But what initiation actually is the introduction of demonic entities into the person, who then do open a channel to the spiritual world, but it's not the unfallen spiritual world, it's the very fallen spiritual world. So when Dietrich Eckart bragged, I have given him the means to communicate with the powers, those sure as hell weren't the powers of heaven, those were the powers of hell. And if you ever look at a copy of Mein Kampf, which of course was Hitler's main exposition of what he was all about, the very last paragraph of Mein Kampf is a dedication of the work to his mentor Dietrich Eckart. Okay? So one of these streams that flowed into the determination to exterminate the Jews was essentially Satanism and occultism that, of course, Hitler was an excellent vehicle for because he was actually an occultist and had been initiated. Another stream that flowed into it was eugenics. Now, you know that the principle behind the determination to exterminate the Jews was to purify the bloodlines of the taint of the Jewish race. Let me back up a step. I had mentioned that the occult society that was Hitler's first public platform was the Thule Society. The Thule legend, that's T-H-U-L-E, in Germany, it's essentially the German version of the Atlantis legend. You know the story. Atlantis, or Thule, was a continent, a mythical continent in the Atlantic Ocean where the people had superpowers. They could travel, magically through the air, they had telepathy and so forth. This continent sank under the waves of the Atlantic, but before it sank, some of the people from this continent with these superpowers fled to Europe. And they lost their powers because of interbreeding with inferior races. But if their bloodlines could be restored through selective breeding, they would regain those powers. That was the Superman myth. That was what Hitler was after in eradicating the human gene pool from Jewish blood. And that was what he was after with all of his selective breeding. I don't know how much of this you're familiar with, but he had these like breeding farms where SS men who fit the profile of being, blonde and Aryan and so forth, would be matched with Aryan women, not their wives, in order to breed Aryan children so that over a few generations the bloodline could be restored and the German people could essentially regain their heritage, which they had from Thule, of being supermen. So anyway, eugenics was at the center of Hitler's program because eugenics was basically the program of selective breeding. Hitler was made chancellor on January 30th, 1933. Within 4 months, he had set up essentially a eugenics institute for compulsory sterilization of inferior people, for the euthanization of disabled children by drugs or cessation of feeding, under which over 250,000 children were killed at birth. In fact, every doctor and midwife had a form to check off, one of two boxes, whether the child who was just born should be allowed to live or not. I'm obviously from the United States. I don't know how bad things are in New Zealand, but it's not impossible to see people kind of having the wheels turning in their head already in the United States, you know, kind of just chomping at the bit to do something like this. And something that not enough people know is there was a constant interplay between Hitler's Eugenics Institute and Margaret Sanger's Birth Control League. In other words, Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. In fact, the director of the German Eugenics Institute, which was behind all of these programs, was a Dr. Ernst Ruden, who was a frequent contributor to Margaret Sanger's Birth Control Review, which was essentially the Birth Control League was the direct predecessor of Planned Parenthood. Another Margaret Sanger board member named Lothrop Stoddard had written a book in 1920 called The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. And Goebbels, who was the Third Reich's propaganda minister, complained to Hitler that basically a foreigner's book shouldn't be the foundation of the German eugenics program, but it was. And it was the foundation of the eugenics teaching in the German school system. This book written by a Margaret Sanger Birth Control League board member. In the Birth Control Review, Margaret Sanger in fact published what she called a plan for peace, which was essentially a plan to set up concentration camps and to take people who were eugenically undesirable, which actually included, but it included Catholics in Margaret Sanger's view. It included Southern European immigrants, Italian Catholics and so forth, and to give them the choice of compulsory sterilization or having to live out their lives in segregated, the genders segregated, in these concentration camps so that they would not breed, so that the eugenics of the American people could be improved. As a matter of fact, here's the quote from the end of her plan. With the future citizen safeguarded from hereditary taints, with 5 million mental and moral degenerates segregated, and 10 million women and 10 million children under this obligatory care, we could then turn our attention to the basic needs for international peace. So the second leg, and I can't go too, I wish I had hours and hours, but I don't, too far with this, was essentially what we're seeing today was then also the second leg of what fed into the Holocaust, which was eugenics and this attempt to among other things, everybody knows this, the Planned Parenthood and the Birth Control League was what first made contraception legal and acceptable in the United States and then made abortion legal and acceptable in the United States. And the very same spiritual impulse which was at the center of Hitler's campaign to exterminate the Jewish people is at the center of Planned Parenthood and of this impulse towards contraception and abortion. Am I making sense so far? I'm going to end on a happy note, don't worry. Very happy note, actually, because everything is divine providence. But one reason I like giving these talks is precisely we're living in, it must have been really, really hard, needless to say, to be living in the mid-30s and see what was happening in Nazi Germany. And it's very hard to live today and see what's happening with our culture and our civilization and still maintain faith that God is entirely in charge and that nothing is happening outside of his control. And this is the unfolding of salvation history as he actually described already in the Old Testament and certainly in the New Testament. So one of the reasons for going through this is to flesh that out. So then when we leave here and we look at all of the dark forces in the world, we see the pattern, we see what's going on, and it's not a cause for discouragement. It's in fact a cause for kind of just seeing salvation history unfolding the way we actually always knew it was going to. So the third leg is sexual depravity, the third leg which led into the Holocaust, that led into the Nazi Party. This has been suppressed in some way. But According to an official of the Berlin Sex Research Institute at the time named Ludwig Lenz, over 90% of the early Nazis were active homosexuals. The brown shirts, who were the bully boys, the irregular army that basically forced Hitler into power. In other words, beat up and killed any political opponents to Hitler and any activity against him and so forth, were an openly homosexual division of the Freikorps. They were founded by, as an explicitly homosexual division by a homosexual named Gerhard Rossbach. And in the days of Hitler, they were led by another very in-your-face, openly homosexual leader named Ernst Röhm. And in fact, in the days of Hitler, the high command of the brown shirts, their meeting place was a permanently reserved table at the largest gay bar in Munich called the Bratwurstviertel Tavern. And again, this is absolutely documented. In fact, when I discovered this, and I was really amazed by it, I mentioned it to my father, who had lived in Germany in those days. And he just looked at me funny and said, "What do you mean? We all knew that." They all knew at the time that the Nazi movement was largely a homosexual movement in the beginning. Himmler, in fact, complained to Hitler that it constituted a danger to the Nazi movement if it could be said that Nazi leaders are chosen for sexual reasons, in other words, because they were homosexual. And Hitler, according to an OSS, which is the predecessor of the CIA, in other words, a US intelligence report, Hitler received a dishonorable discharge from the First World War for a homosexual activity in the barracks. And he had a record as a homosexual prostitute from 1907 to 1912 in Vienna. So, and by the way, he also, to lead the Hitler Youth, had released from jail a convicted pederast named Baldur von Schirach to lead the Hitler Youth. So, I'm giving this very briefly. In my book, Salvation is from the Jews, there's probably about 100 pages about this itself. But today, my point was just that the determination to exterminate the Jews was a direct expression of the satanic will. And everywhere you look in the means used to bring it about, you see a reflection of the fact of the streams that flowed straight back to hell. And of course, it's worthwhile looking at streams that are emerging in our culture and in our value system today, and being quite suspicious, needless to say, of where they're coming and where they want to go. So anyway, as I started out saying, okay, so the determination to exterminate the Jews was a diabolical effort to either stop the conversion of the Jews or eliminate the Jews in order to stop the Second Coming. It obviously failed, but it succeeded far too well in stopping the conversion of the Jews because as a result of the Holocaust coming out of World War II, the Catholic Church, before World War II, the Catholic Church had probably at least a dozen religious orders and fraternities and so forth dedicated to praying for the conversion of the Jews. There was a religious order, the Sisters of Zion, that existed only for praying for the conversion of the Jews. And there were a number of sodalities and so forth. All of that, of course, has been suppressed after coming out of World War II, because of the Holocaust. But it's rather ridiculous for a believing Catholic to kind of say, basically repeat what the Jewish community says, because what the Jewish community says is, how can you pray for the conversion of the Jews? Didn't you do enough damage with the Holocaust? I apologize for saying it, but you hear that. And it's like, how can you compare giving the greatest gift that God has ever given to mankind, which is the intimacy with God that's only available through the sacraments of the Catholic Church? In other words, how can you compare the greatest good you can give someone to the greatest evil you can do to someone? I mean, there is a really fundamental error there that a Catholic actually should not fall for. There are at least 3 reasons why I think it's a very good idea to pray for the conversion of the Jews. One is it is frankly, the whole Gentile world owes salvation and owes everything they have through Christianity and the Catholic Church, in some sense, to the Jewish people, right? In other words, the Jews brought the rest of the world Jesus. Shouldn't we return the favor? If the Jews brought the entire Gentile world, the greatest gift God has given to mankind, simple justice would suggest that one returns the favor. And another reason is what I mentioned, which is the second coming can't happen until there's a widespread conversion of the Jews. And I don't know about you people, but I certainly am getting pretty tired of the way the world is going and would like to see the second coming come as fast as possible. And in fact, on a more responsibly theological note, Jesus said, and I don't have the quote exactly, I don't even remember whether it's from the book of Revelation or whether it's from the Gospels themselves, but he talks about the end times and how bad things will be, and he said, unless those days were shortened, even the elect would be lost, but for the sake of the elect, those days were shortened. So that's, in other words, as people fall away from the church, as people get led into more and more serious sin, and more souls get lost, you kind of want the second coming to happen sooner rather than later, because you want it to happen before more people are lost rather than fewer people are lost. So let me go into the last phase of this talk, which is actually based on Romans 11, and it's the tapestry of the mystery of the role of Jews in between the first and second coming, and the interplay between Jew and Gentile in between the first and second coming, and the failure of the Jews to have accepted Christ at the time of the first coming. And all of that is addressed by St. Paul in his letter to the Romans. So let me go into that. And I don't even know, someone will come out with a hook, I'm sure, to let me know when I better stop. But let me just start with the beginning of Romans 11 and try to unfold what we know about this mystery. So starting at the beginning, let me get the scripture actually. Okay. This reading from Romans 11. This is St. Paul speaking. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. So, of course, a flat statement that even though the Jewish people had rejected Jesus, and even though the Jewish leaders certainly were very much responsible for the death of Jesus, despite that, God has not rejected the Jewish people. You can't be more direct than what St. Paul said. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. But then St. Paul goes on, what about the mystery of the Jews' failure to recognize Jesus when he was here? So then he says, what then? Israel failed to obtain what it sought. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that should not see and ears that should not hear, down to this very day. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see. Okay, tremendously mysterious, right? Here we see that the Jews' failure to recognize Jesus wasn't simply due to their hard-heartedness and stubbornness and so forth, but was in fact in itself a mysterious act of divine providence, right? He says, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that should not see and ears that should not hear. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see. Fortunately, St. Paul goes on then to explain why God did this. So continuing in Romans 11, so I ask, have they stumbled so as to fall? By no means, but through their trespass salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? For their rejection means the reconciliation of the world. What will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? Okay, and let me explain this a little bit. He says, through their trespass salvation has come to the Gentiles. Their trespass meant riches for the world. Their rejection meant the reconciliation of the world. What's he referring to? What was the very first crisis in the church? What was the very first burning question that required the very first church council to be held to resolve it? A question, a crisis, which was in danger of actually, in some sense, sinking Christianity. We see this in Acts chapter 15. It was the Council of Jerusalem, called around 51 AD. All of the apostles had to come back to Jerusalem to determine this issue. What was the question? The question was, are we allowed to let Gentiles into the church, or is Christianity only for Jews? And I'm not making this up. I think many of you know this. The surface manifestation of this, which is mentioned in Acts, is circumcision. Basically, does one have to be circumcised in order to be a Christian? That was simply a concrete example of having to be Jewish before becoming Christian. In other words, what some of the apostles thought was that if a Gentile, in other words, any non-Jew, wanted to become a Christian, he first had to become a Jew before he qualified to become a Christian. Now, you can understand why they made this mistake, because, of course, Jesus was Jewish, the apostles were Jewish, all of the disciples were Jewish. When Peter preached on Pentecost Sunday and 3,000 people were baptized, they were all Jews and so forth. Christianity began coming out of Judaism. It looked like a branch of Judaism. It was a very natural mistake to make, to think that maybe this was only for Jews. That mistake was avoided precisely by the Jews' rejection of Christianity. Because pretty soon, and again you see this in the book of Acts, Paul would go from town to town. He would preach the gospel. 5 minutes? Okay, fine. He would preach the gospel first to the Jews. They would reject him, then to the Gentiles. And the Gentiles would accept it and enter the church. The Jews wouldn't. Pretty soon, the church looked Gentile, and there was no longer any danger of that. But with that 5-minute warning, let me race to the end of Romans 11. So anyway, let me just read those verses again and go on. Through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Okay, so if the Jews' failure to recognize Jesus was such a blessing for the world, just imagine what a blessing it will be when they accept Jesus. Then he goes on to say, for if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? And then he goes into his picture of the olive tree, which is his central picture of the interplay between Jew and Gentile in the period between the first and second coming. So he says, so he's comparing the tree of salvation to this olive tree, and he says, but if some of the branches were broken off, and you, a wild olive shoot, were grafted in their place to share the richness of the olive tree, do not boast over the branches. If you do boast, remember, it was not you that support the root, but the root that supports you. You will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. But even the others, if they do not persist in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. For if you have been cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? So you see the image there. This olive tree of salvation was originally the Jewish people. The root of the tree is Judaism. The original cultivated olive branches were the Jews. Some of those branches were broken off. That's the Jews who didn't follow Jesus. But if they were broken off, they were only broken off to make room to graft in wild olive branches, which are the Gentiles. And when all of the wild olive branches have been grafted in, God will graft back in the natural olive branches again, which are the Jews who rejected Jesus. And when he does, and don't blame me, I'm not saying this, St. Paul is, they'll be even better suited to the tree because they were originally a part of that cultivated olive tree. So going back to Romans 11, lest you be wise in your own conceits, I want you to understand this mystery, brethren. A hardening has come upon part of Israel, until the full number of Gentiles come in, and so all Israel will be saved. In other words, God's plan is to wait until the full number of Gentiles have come in, the gospel has been preached to the four corners of the earth and so forth, and only then bring the Jews back into the church, and then the church composed of Jew and Gentile will be ready for the second coming. Going back to Romans 11. As regards the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake, but as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. Just as you were once disobedient to God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience, so they have now been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you they also may receive mercy. For God has consigned all men to disobedience, that he may have mercy upon all. So you see here why God did this way. I'll just read those verses again, and then I'll explain them for the 60 seconds I have left. Just as you were, St. Paul is speaking to the Gentiles, just as you were once disobedient to God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience. In other words, the Gentile world started out in a state of disobedience to God, out of relationship to God. And then, so when they came into the church, it was obvious to them and to everyone that their salvation was a sovereign act of the mercy of God. But the Jews, at the time that Jesus came, were in a, quote, state of obedience to God. They were in a state of relationship to God. So if they had started out in the church, they would have never passed through a period of disobedience. So they would not have seen salvation as an unmerited gift of the mercy of God. They would have seen it as something they earned, that they deserved for being so good. And you see this in the New Testament, in their attitude, right? The Gentiles had started out in a state of disobedience, so that when they entered the church, it was obvious to them that it was a sovereign act of the mercy of God. But the Jewish people had to pass through a period of disobedience, so that when they come into the church, they will also realize that it is a sovereign act of the mercy of God, and nothing they could have possibly deserved or earned, right? So let me just read again those 3 verses and close with a prayer. Just as you were once disobedient to God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience, so they have now been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may receive mercy. For God has consigned all men to disobedience, that he may have mercy upon all. Amen, and what a privilege to be giving this talk on Divine Mercy Sunday. And let me close with a prayer for the conversion of the Jews. And I have some prayer cards in the back on my book table with this prayer on the back. But it's a completely kosher, if you excuse the expression, Catholic prayer. It is from the First Vatican Council. It was a postulatum that was hardly endorsed by the Pope of the Council, who was Pope Pius IX. And it was signed by virtually all of the Council Fathers. And it is a prayer on the part of the church inviting the Jews into the church. So let me just close with that prayer, and then tomorrow afternoon I'll give what I had promised to give now, which was my witness testimony. So here's the prayer from the First Vatican Council. The undersigned Fathers of the Council humbly yet urgently, beseechingly pray that the Holy Ecumenical Council of the Vatican come to the aid of the unfortunate nation of Israel with an entirely paternal invitation, that finally, exhausted by a wait no less futile than long, the Israelites hasten to recognize the Messiah, our Savior, Jesus Christ, truly promised to Abraham and announced by Moses, thus completing and crowning, not changing, the religion of Moses. The undersigned Fathers have the very firm confidence that the Holy Council will have compassion on the Israelites, because they are always very dear to God on account of their fathers, and because it is from them that the Christ was born according to the flesh. Would that they then speedily acclaim the Christ, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed be he who comes in the name of the Lord. Would that they hurl themselves into the arms of the Immaculate Virgin Mary, even now their sister according to the flesh, who wishes likewise to be their mother according to grace, as she is ours. Amen. Amen, and thank you.